is claiming that these ideas were resolved and you should adopt this banking system, which didn't even exist at the time, and which she learned about from the words of Mike Montagne issued from Benjamin Franklin's mouth, and she couldn't even justify how that story was non-inflationary. All right? So, let's listen to the next part.
Congress feels that they have to bail out the banking system, and the real reason is that we think that we're dependent on this banking system for our credit, but we're not. Like Dorothy and all the characters in The Wizard of Oz, we have the power to create our own money and our own credit. The government's mentality in general seems to be, we'll do what we have to do and we'll worry about paying for it later.
Well, great. She discovered that she herself discovered, Ellen Hodgson Brown discovered that The Wizard of Oz was written as a parody of economy somehow. And so, anyway, this bank that doesn't exist, we don't really need to rely on it, but she doesn't even give the reason why we don't need to rely on it. In other words, do we need a publisher for our promissory obligations or not? And is that the issue that it's reduced to? And if she's the author of solution, why didn't she introduce this to us? And why isn't she advocating mathematically perfected economy instead of what she is, which is money that may be a debt and may not be a debt, but is mentioned in one case is one thing and in another case is another thing, as if those things somehow benefit us without even justifying how. This is preposterous.
But what you could do is pay for it now.
Okay. What you could do is pay for it now. In other words, well, money won't be a debt, but it will be a debt whenever we want it to be a debt. But to coerce you into, to sway you into believing that this is somehow to your benefit, we'll say that our money isn't a debt, even though if you ask them about certain things, they're going to have to answer that there has to be an obligation to pay all money out of circulation. There's no such thing as issuing credit, a promissory obligation, without an obligation to retire it. No such thing. Can't even happen. Moreover, what is going on here is you're having someone who is pretending to be an authority on these issues advocate something which isn't even to your detriment. Is debt to your detriment? If we can't assume a debt, a new couple can't buy this $100,000 home with a 100-year lifespan for a fraction of what a part-time person can make at a fast food store now, $83.33 a month. No, we can't have debt, so we couldn't have that. Debt is not the problem. Inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of artificial indebtedness is a terminal problem, but the very fact that the banks get to keep the principal for merely issuing the evidence of our promissory obligations to us is the first crime. You see? So it isn't just that we can divorce ourselves from the banking system, which is what I advocated from the beginning. So why would someone else stand up afterward and say, oh, this is a solution? Okay? As if they authored it when, in arguments against me, she was claiming 2 years ago that she doesn't even see that interest is a problem.
In other words, you don't have to pay for it later. You don't have to pay for it with debt. You can just pay for it with money.
Well, if you have to pay for it later, it is a debt, Ellen.
In the Money Master's solution, the government creates all the money in the form of debt-free U.S. notes or their electronic equivalents, and then spends that money into existence through the normal budgetary process.
Okay, there again. So Bill Stills pretends to be an author of solution, and money doesn't have to be a debt. So we know where this idea that's all over the internet now, that money as a debt is a problem, and we have all these people who claim that a debt is an issue. Well, we evidently should never have debts, or money can't come into circulation as a debt, even though to solve inflation, you have to pay it out of circulation, and every issuance of credit is an obligation to do so. You see? So this guy is talking nonsense as well. I mean, it sounds good, you know, that the government is just going to spend this into circulation. But what would you have if you did this? You would have a huge socialist apparatus deciding what to spend money on, and to own a $100,000 home with a 100-year lifespan, we would have to save the $100,000 to buy the house if we can't ever engage in any indebtedness, which is simply an obligation to pay for a thing as we consume of it. So let's listen to him go on further here.
Existing money is, of course, replaced one for one with the new debt-free money.
Evidently, he's saying this to compete with me. How would you replace it, Bill? You see? Now, the transformation to mathematically perfected economy resolves that issue by counting all prior payments of interest toward principal. So is that an audacious thing, or is somehow the government just going to print this money and they're going to pay it to somebody? And he hasn't even said anything about whether or not that money might even be spent on anything by whoever just gets it. In other words, well, where's it all going to go? It's going to go to the central banking system if you pay off the debt. So we are going to enrich in the Federal Reserve System and all the other central banking systems of the world to this further artificial degree by solving it according to Bill Still's, purported solution. And, he isn't even saying why we should do that.
The national debt is paid off with this new money as well.
There you go. Exactly as I said. And just what Ron Paul calls inflation.
But to prevent inflation, reserve requirements are gradually raised on the commercial banks, requiring them to maintain 100% reserves.
Well, that's so preposterous. I mean, if you're not rolling over on the floor laughing by now, excuse me. They've already exceeded those requirements, and he's talking about issuing more money into circulation. So how exactly would he even do this? But, even worse, why would we even need to? You understand, in mathematically perfected economy, and only in mathematically perfected economy, the money in circulation equals the remaining value of the represented property, and so the money is always redeemable in the represented property and vice versa. You see? So that's the only thing that solves this issue. And so, one final.
In other words, banks could then only loan out money they actually have.
Well, sorry, Bill, you broke that rule in your earlier assertion that we're just going to create all that money. Well, yeah, you're just going to pay it into circulation, but if banks could only loan out money they already have, first of all, you're revealing to us that you don't understand the obfuscation of the currency. Furthermore, you're limiting banks to issuing currency which they never had in the first place. There would be no money in existence. So, with that, I hope you'll all have a week or so to ruminate on this, and there'll be many questions for me next week to answer, and we will carry on this discussion. If you happen to be a friend of Bill Still's, or Ron Paul, or Dennis Kucinich, or Ellen Hodgson Brown, or Stephen Zarlenga, by all means, invite them to respond, and we'll have them on the show, and we'll debate these issues before you, and so that all of us can understand what is a solution and what is not. Thanks very much for everyone listening in.